Hi everyone, how are you doing? It is Saganya. I'm back. This is Global Trends course for New Abyssinia College students, and today we will start chapter 5, which is the last chapter. The topics of for the chapter 5 is the major contemporary global issues. So before that, last time we saw about globalization and regionalism. We said globalization is a trend in which the world is becoming a small place with the revolutions of information technology, and we also saw regionalism. It is an activity in which countries who are found in the same geographical location cooperate each other more than the other countries. And we also saw the relationship between regionalism and globalization. We also saw that globalization has different effect for developing and developed countries. And in general, we say developing countries are less beneficiaries from globalization. Today, in this last chapter, we will see about contemporary global issues. As I said, when we start chapter 1, there are a lot of issues which have a global influence or a global impact, either positively or negatively. So in this chapter, we will cover all those issues. So one of the most important dynamics of the 21st century is that the shift in focus from international relation to global relation and issues. So before the 21st century, the main issue or the issue of interrelation among countries, but now the issue are becoming more global rather than the relationship between 2 and 3 countries. And with the rise of China, Brazil, India, and other emerging market countries, many countries are struggling to catch up with globalization. So before the 21st century, it was Russia and US or United States of America who were the leaders of the world politics and economic system. But with this 21st century, China is becoming a superpower. Brazil, India, Indonesia, and some other countries are also becoming very big and the main players of the international politics and economic system. Social workers, social networkers, on the other hand, other than these countries, social networks such as Facebook and Twitter are becoming also becoming instrument in spreading popular revolts across the globe. So in the old time, it was the politics and the countries who have been the main role in the international political economic relation. But at this time, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media companies are becoming very influential, even more than countries. For example, if we see the Arab Spring which started in 2010 and 11, it started mainly by using Facebook. And if you also see the revolution and the a lot of political activities happening in our country, it is mainly influenced by Facebook and activists in Facebook. So this chapter thus examines the major contemporary global issues in the 21st century. So we cover what are the main issues that are influencing the world in the time we are living. So we will divide these issues into 4. The first one is global security issue. The second one, global environmental issue. The third one, global socio-economic issue. And the last one, global cultural issue. We will see what are these issues and how they are affecting our daily day-to-day life. So surveys of major contemporary global issues. The period we are living is often referred to as post-Cold War period, which rests upon the predominance of a new issue. So the Cold War ended mainly in the 1990s and in the 1980s, and we call the period we are living right now as a 21st century or the post-Cold War period. No longer in the world politics is dominated by issues arising from East-West relations. The threats of nuclear war, the ideology struggle between liberal democracy and Marxist-Leninism. So in this time, the main issue in the global politics is the East-West relation. The West relation, which is the main actors, including United States of America and the Europe, whereas in the East, there is China, India, Japan, and other influencing powers in the Southern Asian countries. So the international community is now preoccupied with new world order and many global problems. So in this time we are living, there is a new world order mainly influenced by the United States of America. We saw what is new world order is, which means free trade, which is liberalization and free movements of goods and services, and having or developing liberal democracy in the political system, which is also called the Washington Consensus. So in the 21st century, the main problems, a problem became a global issue are the following, or the following became the main issue or the main problems in our lifetime. The first one is, what is the extent or scopes of the issue? A problem becomes, in here we divided global issues into four. So how we divided those issues at the world became, the world main issue is based on these four criteria. The first one is, what is the extent or scopes of the issue? The scopes of the issue is how many countries are being influenced by the issues we listed. The second one is, what is the urgency or intensity of the issue? How much is that issue affecting the countries? The third is, what is the silence or visibility of a given issue? This in here, how much the medias are taking the issue seriously and how much media coverage the issue got from the media, as well as how much the politicians are involved to solve the problem. The first is, what is the centrality or the locations of an issue, which means where the issue is mainly started from. So if we see political, environmental problems, cultural problems, from where they are coming. So by using these four criteria, there are four major contemporary global issues, and we will see these four issues one by one. The first one is global security issue. In this security arena, there are two main issues, and following challenges facing the emerging new world order. When we say global security issue, we divided the security issue into two. The first one is terrorism, and the other one is nuclear proliferation. That means the increasing in the productions of nuclear weapons by many countries. When we start from global terrorism, terrorism is a use of violence in the form of hostage-taking, bombing, hijacking, and other indiscriminatory attacks on civilians targeted to fulfill one's political and other objective. So we say terrorism is one of the global security issues in the 21st century. Terrorism is when someone attacks civilians for the goals of achieving his political and other aspirations. So to call some action a terrorism, that should happen on making harm on civilian peoples. So if someone comes up with a bomb and shoots people in the market or in the mall or in another civilian stations, we call that terrorism. And the main causes of terrorism are the ones listed in this PowerPoint. The first one is socio-economic causes. When you see socio-economic causes, it includes poverty, feeling of hopelessness, violations of human rights, and lack of democracy. So why people became a terrorist is mainly because of socio-economic issue, which is one of the main issues. The second issue or the second cause of terrorism is political cause, which includes failures of government to address problem, lack of democracy, and good governance. If you see the Middle Eastern countries, for example, Syria, Libya, or Iraq, there is a failure of government there. So when there is a failure of government, most of the people are unable to fulfill their economic and other needs, and that failures of government results war results losing of one's family and everything that turns people to become a terrorist. The other cause of terrorism is psychological cause, which includes humiliation, which is the main cause of terrorism. Humiliation is another factor conducive to use of terrorism. And these three factors turns people into a terrorist, and this terrorism became one of the global security issue in the 21st century. We can also divide terrorism into 5 common types. We can divide terrorists into 5, or terrorism into 5 common types. The first one is domestic terrorism. It occurs when the borders of a particular country and its association with extremist groups. When a terrorism happens in the borders of one's country, it is called domestic terrorism. That means if someone brings a bomb to some country and bombed some mall or other public stations, it is called domestic terrorism. The other is nationalist terrorism. It is closely associated with struggle for political autonomy and independence. This is related with when some ethnic group or some groups of peoples became nationalist and wants to fulfill their nationalist agenda by attacking the peoples of some specific country. This happens mainly when some ethnic group or some parts of a country wants to cede itself from one other country. For example, when there was a struggle between Eritrea and Ethiopia, there was bombing in different hotels and in different places by the extremist nationalists who want to cede from the country, and we call that nationalist terrorism. The other is religious terrorism, and it is grown out of extreme fundamentalist religious groups that believe that God is one on their side, and that their violence is divinely inspired and approved. So in here, when people uses religion as a pretext or a precondition to attack another people or to bomb a hotel or a town or something, which is called religious terrorism. That means the people are making a terrorist attack to fulfill their religious objective. The other types of terrorism is state terrorism. State terrorism is a cold, calculated, efficient, and extremely destructive forms of terrorism by the government. So when the government uses its military or its force to exterminate or to attack peoples who are civilians, that is called state terrorism. For example, if a government uses its power to eliminate one ethnic group or one peoples by some specific peoples of the country, that is called state terrorism. The other is global terrorism, which is the 5th types of terrorism. This is partly an outgrowth of a force of globalization. And in different parts of the world, there are peoples who are against globalization or who believe globalization is causing a lot of negative influence on their day-to-day life. So when they make an attack to curb the growth of globalization, it is called global terrorism. So these are the 5 types of terrorism or 5 types of terrorists. The second global security issue is nuclear weapon and their proliferation. So this one is first the existence of nuclear weapon and increasing in number of countries who owns this global nuclear weapons. So in the Cold War period, competition for acquiring nuclear weapon was a big issue. Before the 1918 and the 1990, countries compete to get nuclear weapon, and US and Russia were the main owners of the weapon, and a lot of other countries were used to compete to own a nuclear weapon. But after the Cold War, the issue became a secondary concern for countries. So now the US is the main superpower, and there is no military support like the Cold Time period. So countries are not that much in a rush to have a nuclear weapon, but still many people believe it is still a main problem in the present or in the 21st century. Why they think nuclear weapon is still the main challenge of the 21st century is because of these four factors. The first one is the fact that nuclear weapon states have substantially maintained their nuclear arsenal. Even if they stop the competition to own additional nuclear weapon, countries who have the nuclear weapon still maintains a substantial amount of it. So since the nuclear weapon exists by the hands of different countries, they believe it is an existential threat to the global security. The second one is there are no greater incentive to acquire nuclear weapon for those non-nuclear states who have lost the guarantee of extended deterrence previously provisionally provided by superpowers. And they believe there is an incentive to acquire weapons for non-nuclear states. This has happened when they believe in the old time there was two superpowers who played a role so protecting the security of their country. But after the Cold War, when the Russia power declines, these countries have no one to protect their security, and they believe this becomes an incentive for them to work hard to have or to acquire nuclear weapon. And the third is emergency of new big powers and competition appear to have increased the incentive to proliferations. That means the emergence of new big powers. That means, as I said, when I start this chapter, there are new superpowers like Russia, India, Brazil, and Indonesia. They are increasing in their economic power. And like the old superpowers, they also want to have a nuclear weapons of their own. And this becomes an incentive for proliferation. The fourth fact which makes nuclear weapon still the main global threat is the constraining experience of Iraq and North Korea, who are developing a nuclear weapon. So by this time, if you saw media in the last 2 or 3 years, nuclear weapon developments of North Korea and Iraq, as well as Iran, became the main issue of the global security issue, and many countries believe North Korea and countries like North Korea and Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. And by seeing these four factors, many people believe nuclear weapon like terrorism is the main global security issue in the 21st century. In addition to the following four events, increasing fear about horizontal nuclear proliferation, there is a fear of horizontal nuclear proliferation since the end of the Cold War. And many people believe there is countries who have already acquired a nuclear weapon are selling those nuclear weapons to other countries, and we call it horizontal nuclear proliferation. And what is shows the existence of this truth is that first, the aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War, UN weapon inspection team discovered alarming evidence that found Iraq had made significant progress towards its nuclear weapon capability. They found that Iraq is developing a nuclear capacity. Second, the demise of Soviet Union, which resulted emergence of new states which retained sectors of the Soviet military industry complex, are also developing, have the capacity to develop nuclear power. When the Soviet Union was one country, its military complex was in different parts of their region, like in Bulgaria or in Ukraine and in other countries who were parts of the Soviet Union. When Soviet Union was demised, it was divided into many countries, and those countries still acquire those military complexes who have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons. So the existence of that one, they believe, is creating horizontal nuclear proliferation. Third, a nuclear arms race begins in South Asia after nuclear tests by India and Pakistan in May 1998. After India and Pakistan was divided and after Pakistan becomes independent from India, they are still in no war, no peace situation. And there are a lot of military conflict between those countries, especially in the Kashmir region. And that results in a competition between these countries for the developments of nuclear weapon. And this also happens in another parts of the world. The fourth one is in 2003, the International Atomic Energy Agency uncovered illicit supply network in an investigation that Iran had an illicit nuclear weapon program. So by this time, it is clear that the Iranians are developing a nuclear weapons of their own. And this fourth development make clear that there is a horizontal nuclear proliferation in the world, and that makes nuclear weapon a threat of security in the 21st century. There are reasons for the proliferations of weapons. Why countries are working hard to have their own nuclear power. Even small countries who are not very big economically are competing to have this nuclear weapon. And there are strategic, economic, and political motivations for weapon proliferation. This includes superpower revival during the Cold War. Geopolitics consideration influences the US and Soviet Union to transfer power weapons to their respective allies. So when we see the main reason, the first one is superpower rivalry in the Cold War. US and Soviet Union developed a lot of nuclear weapons, and they give those nuclear weapons to their allies in their different countries. For example, the US gives India the nuclear weapon, and then Russia gives the nuclear weapon to Pakistan. Then US gives the nuclear weapon to Israel. Like that, the nuclear weapon becomes available or exists in different parts of the world through the competitions of those superpowers. The other is military burden sharing. Reluctant to engage in direct military confrontation, countries provide weapons, technical assistance, and arms production technology to their allies so that they could defend themselves. So big countries like US and Soviet Union have their own allies, and for their allies, they give us military support. For example, US gives a lot of military support for Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and also for Israel. On the other hand, Russia gives nuclear support, military support in the forms of weapons to Iran and Syria and other countries. So this competition, these situations of not going to these countries don't want to go to these countries and fight. Rather, they want to give weapon and secure their alliance. The other is regional balance of power. Arms sales are often defended on the ground that such transfer contributes to regional stability and diminish the likelihood of war. So they believe when there is imbalance of military power, it results in war. So to prevent any war that could possibly happen, they try to balance the military capacity of countries by giving military support. The other is political, military, and economic influences. Countries like USA give us military support to get the influence or to get acceptance from that countries. By giving military support, they control those countries. So that is a strategy by developed countries or countries who have large nuclear development or weapon development capacity. The other reason is economics of scale. Many countries export weapons to obtain resources to finance the development and productions of more advanced weapons. So to develop a more advanced weapon, countries want to get additional income, and to get that income, they sell weapons. So when they sell a lot of weapons, the availability and its threat to the world security increases with time. The other is self-reliance. Many countries develop their own weapon to prevent or enhance their independence. So when countries are afraid of their security, or when they want to become self-sufficient on their own military capacities, they develop nuclear weapons. And there is economic factors. Much of global weapon trade is motivated by financial considerations. Many companies who are well known on the developments of military equipment produce those equipment mainly to get financial benefit from them. There is ethnic conflict, which is becoming the main issue in the global politics by this time, and ethnic issue generates demand for weapon transfer. For example, in Africa, there is ethnic conflict in South Sudan, there is ethnic conflict in Sudan, in Chad, in Central Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Congo, in almost all countries of Africa, and this increases the demand for weapon and its availability. The other is authoritarian regime. Governments that rule without consent of the people generally rely on military force to exercise power. Authoritarian regimes in many countries purchase large amount of weapons to keep the security of those countries and to secure their power for a long period of time. And these are the reasons why there is a proliferation of weapons in the world. So that is all about the global security issue. The second global problem is global environmental issue. And this global environmental issue is gradually becoming one of the most pressing issues of the 21st century. And the main global environmental issue of our time is climate change and global warming. So I hope all of you heard about global warming from different medias, and there are a lot of activists in the world who influences who calls for a green revolution, or decreasing the things which are affecting or which is increasing the temperatures of the world. So when we see climate change and global warming, climate change poses numerous and harsh challenge for sustainable development, and its effects are being felt in all regions of the world. So it is becoming one of the main issues of sustainable development. So global environmental issue, which is mainly an increase in the temperatures of the world. And when temperature increases, that results in climate change, like erosion and flooding, and also other tsunamis in different parts of the world. And it is threatening a sustainable development in the world. On the other hand, degree of, even if it is affecting the world's sustainable development at a global level, it is degree of vulnerability varies even more with developing countries and poor, which have contributed the least to global warming. As in the world, industries are the main contributors for global warming, and poor countries have very least contribution for the increasing of temperature in the world, whereas even if they have a very small contribution for global warming, they are the one who are negatively affecting or who are becoming vulnerable for global warming. And in recent times, the effort to solve the problems are increasing with the treaties in Doha 2012 and Kyoto Protocol in 2013. So in recent time, countries are trying to solve the issues of global warming and climate change by coming into an agreement which caps the amount of greenhouse emission countries can contribute, or it puts a restriction on the amounts of greenhouse emission a country generates. However, the greenhouse reduction goal set in the Kyoto Protocol remains largely unachieved because of the reluctance of developing countries. So when you want to decrease your greenhouse emission or your carbon emission, you need to close some unnecessary industries like the coal industry and others who are the main contributors of global warming. So countries don't want to close that one because that affects the economy, and these goals are largely unachieved, even if after 10 and more than years of trial to solve the problem. The third issue in the in the 21st century is global socio-economic issues. And the main global socio-economic issue is global inequality and poverty. Global inequality and poverty. In the last 3 decades, where they were characterized by a widening gap between rich and poor, and the proliferations of millionaires and billionaires. So in the 21st century, few people are becoming very rich, like they're becoming millionaires and billionaires, whereas other billions of people are becoming very poor over time. While economic disparity remained a serious problem in developing countries, the force of globalization created conditions that helped widen the gap between rich and poor in industrial societies. So because of globalization, the rich and poor in developing countries are widening over time, and also globalization also widening the gap between the rich and the poor, even in the industrialized or in the rich countries. And this extreme inequality perpetuates or created poverty and the concentrations of economic and political power, and reduces economic efficiency. So with inequality, it minimizes or it decreases the participations of the people in most of the peoples of the world from economic and political powers, and that resulted economic inefficiency, or it decreases the efficiency of the economy. And it strengthens inequality, perpetuating institutions in 3 ways. This global situation or globalization created inequality in the following 3 ways. The first one is inequality discourages the political participations of poor peoples. When there is inequality, those poor peoples don't have a very large amount of participation in the political system. Inequality also prevents the building and proper functioning of impartial institutions and observance of the rule of law. So when the participations of a large amount of people in the political system is very weak, it resulted also and institutions who are impartial and who works for the benefits of only the rich peoples. Inequality also enabled the wealthy or the rich peoples to refuse to compromise politically or economically, which further weakens the poor society. So when the institutions became more inclined to the needs and the importance of the rich people, they became the central point for the economic and political lives of the society, and that further weakens the poor country or the poor people's situation in the world socio-economic participation. This consequence of inequality combined to ensure that poor societies will remain poor and unequal, trapping most of their inhabitants in a destructive cycles of society. So now the institutions are more inclined to rich people, and they keep the institution by themselves, or the globalized the globalized institutional arrangement keeps poor people poor for a very long time. And inequality also could undermine globalization by influencing countries to adopt protectionist policies and disengage to to the extent possible from the global economy. So when the globalization in the 21st century makes countries, especially developing countries, very difficult to participate in the global political and economic life, they become a protectionist in the extent that they don't want to participate in the global economy. But the ramification extends beyond economic issues to problems such as terrorism and the environment and the spreads of infectious disease. So when these people became very poor and when they are trapped with poverty, they most likely became they involved in terrorism, and they became the main victims of infectious disease and other problems. So globalization, in the globalized world, inequality and economic problems and are becoming the main issues which threatens the global order. In addition to inequality, the other socio-economic, mainly social problems in the 21st century is migration and refuge problem. So now we are dividing global socio-economic issues into global inequality and poverty, and the other one is migration and refuge problem. When we see migration, international migration and refuge seekers, including asylum seekers and internally displaced peoples, have become more prominent on the international agenda in recent time. For example, in Ethiopia, there are a large amount of internal displacement before 2 years, even more than 3 and 4 million people. And in the international, when you see the international migration, there is a large amount of migration from Ethiopia to the Arab countries, from Ethiopia to the other western part of countries. And recently, the largest migration is from the Arab countries to the Europe and other parts of the world because of a large amount of conflict in the Arab countries like Syria, Iraq, and Libya. So what is the main causes of or why becomes migration and refugee problems became the main agenda in the 21st century is because first, the number of states in the international system has steadily increased since the end of First World War. So after the World War, the system or the post-Cold World War system created a lot of countries, more than 200 countries, and that increases the movements of people from one country to the other. Second, there has also been a rapid increase in world population, leads to over-exploitations of regional resources, leading to catastrophic famine and population movement. There is also a large amount of population growth, and that created an exploitations of resources. When there is resource exploitation and farming, people mostly migrates to the other parts of the world, and it increases the amount of movement from country to country. The third is the revolution in the communication and transportation. Transportation has made people aware of conditions and opportunities in the other parts of the world because of the media, and because of the media, mainly the media and the television revolution, people's able to know what is the life, what is the situations of life in another parts of the world. And when they see the life is better in another country, they mostly start to migrate to another country. And when they start migration, the transportation system makes migration possible, and there is revolutions of transportation system. So communication and transportation makes migration larger in the 21st century. And finally, the turmoil and uncertainty of turbulent and unstable world peace played an important role in motivating people to search abroad for a better life. There are instabilities in different parts of the world, and that pushed people from one country to another. For example, in the Dark region, even after the Dark region, the instability in Ethiopia pushed people to US and European countries, and even in the Middle East. So these four factors makes migration on the challenge and concerns of political agenda in developed countries. So now developed countries are more concerned about migration because people from developing countries like Ethiopia wants to go to those developed countries, and now those developed countries don't want to accept those migrants, and that makes migration a main political agenda in the developed world as equal as in the developing world. It also results anti-migration sentiment in many developed worlds. For example, if you hear about Trump, he don't want any migration from Africa and from the Middle East. So a lot of politicians are becoming anti-migrant in the developed world because of a large amount of migration. The fourth and the large global issue or global problem in our time is global cultural issues, or it is called cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism is a result of cultural globalization, a process whereby information, commodities, and images that have been produced in one part of the world enters into a global flow that tends to flatten out cultural differences between nations, regions, and individuals. So there are cultural ideas, especially in the Western world. Those ideas then became spread to other parts of the world, influence the culture in that world, and makes the world culture more similar than it has been. For example, if you see the wearing style, in most parts of the world, most people wear jeans, and this jeans, the trouser jeans, was started in one part of the world, and then it flows to every corners of the world, and now became the main clothes in almost every country. And this is called cultural imperialism. This has sentiment been also portrayed by a process of McDonaldization. For example, if you see McDonald, it is found in almost every countries of the world, and now McDonald is becoming like the best food for many people in many parts of the world. And cultural globalization is mainly fueled by the so-called information revolution, the spreads of satellite communication and telecommunication networks. So why the world is becoming the same in terms of culture is because of the flows of information, communication, and telecommunication flows. There is a television and everyone watches the same movies, the same TV series, and that influences the people in every parts of the world. And this cultural imperialism affects us in the way in which we all watch the same television program, buy the same commodity, eat the same food, and support the same sport star AC. So now the world is becoming flat and or the same in terms of their food, in terms of their clothing, in terms of their preference in television programs, and in almost all aspects of cultural issues, and we call it cultural imperialism. And cultural imperialism created cultural clash and identity conflict. So why it is a problem to have a same clothes, to have a same food, to have a same culture is because it created cultural clash or civilization clash or identity conflicts. Culture and nationalism have generally been closely intertwined, and all society directly or indirectly promotes their value as positive and desirable. The more the difference in the culture, the higher the probability for conflict. So when the Western ideology or the Western culture becomes a dominant culture in every part of the world, that creates a nationalization movement of, that means anti-peoples who are against that culture starts to take hold and became against that culture. And some people in that country already accepted that culture. So when those peoples come together, that created a cultural conflict or identity conflict between countries, peoples who are found in the same country and who are following a different culture. By this time in the international stage there is Western ideology, this Western culture, mainly from the US and from the Europe. There is Confucian culture. It is mainly from Japanese, from the Chinese culture. Confucian is mainly a Chinese types of culture. There's a Japanese culture. There is an Islamic culture, which is mainly in the Middle East. There is a Hindu culture, mainly India and the parts of the world around them. There is Slavic Orthodox culture. It mainly includes Russia and countries around them. There is a Latin American culture in the South America, and there is African culture. And those cultures have their own preferences. That means they have their own beliefs, their own identity, their own values. And they also developed their own civilization. So when the world becomes one because of globalization, these cultures started to clash to one another. And this civilization is a continuous clash to become dominant one another. So every culture wants to become dominant, and every people who mostly wants to accept his own culture as positive and desirable. And when these cultures fight each other, they create a clash and identity conflict in the world. So these four are the main challenges of the world in the 21st century, which are global security issues, global environmental issues, global socio-economic issues, and global cultural issues. Accordingly, issues such as global terrorism, climate change, and global warming, global inequality, poverty, migration, and refugee crisis, and cultural clash, identity conflict, and issues related to this are becoming the most pressing challenges of humanity in the 21st century. So as a country, we need to understand what is the effects of these issues in our social, economic, and political life, and we need to work hard to avert the negative influence of this issue. So this was all about global trends for undergraduate students. Thank you very much. See you next time.